The year was 1877, and Matthew Carter, a 30-year-old rancher, lived in a cabin that sat against the endless horizon of the Arizona plains. His life was a rhythm of cattle calls, creaking saddles, and the lonely whistle of the wind. He had grown used to solitude, speaking more to his animals than to men. But on that spring evening, as dusk painted the sky in bruised colors, his routine fractured. Riding the fence line, checking posts battered by the winter storms, he spotted a shape by the riverbank, something that didn't belong in the wilderness. His chest tightened instantly. At first, he thought it was a discarded bundle or maybe a wounded deer. But as he drew closer, lanterns swinging from his saddle, he saw the truth. It was a woman, an Apache woman. Her face battered, lips cracked, her body curled as though clinging to life itself. She couldn't have been more than his age, perhaps younger, her long black hair tangled with mud and rain. Matthew swung down, his boots sinking into the damp soil, his instincts caught between caution and compassion. In the silence of the plains, her shallow breaths were almost ghostly. Her eyes flickered open as he knelt beside her. They burned with the last embers of defiance, even though she was weak. She muttered words he didn't understand, pushing at him with trembling hands. But her strength failed, and the fight slipped from her grasp. Matthew hesitated. Every story he had ever heard about settlers who aided natives came rushing back, the punishments, the distrust. Yet something in her broken state overpowered the caution in his heart. He reached beneath her shoulders and lifted her carefully, feeling her weight as fragile as a child's. The ride back was silent, except for the steady beat of his horse's hooves. She slumped against him, too weak to resist, her head resting against his chest. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then in sharp sheets, soaking them both. By the time he pushed through the cabin door, he was shivering. He laid her gently near the fire, stripping off his wet coat and tossing it aside. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at her fragile frame curled on his rug, wondering if he had just brought danger or something else into his home. Matthew found an old quilt folded in the chest and draped it over her, tucking the edges close to keep her warm. Her eyes fluttered open again, following his every movement. He spoke softly, though he knew she might not understand. "You're safe here. No one's gonna hurt you." He poured water into a tin cup, kneeling to guide it toward her lips. At first she resisted, turning her face away, but thirst won. She sipped slowly, her cracked lips trembling against the rim. When he offered bread, she took it with the same reluctance, chewing in silence as though weighing every act of kindness. Through the long hours of the storm, Matthew tended to her wounds. He heated water, cleaned the cuts with rough cloth, and smeared salve where bruises darkened her skin. She flinched at his touch but did not pull away. At last, wrapped in his quilt, her breathing steadied, though her eyes never left him. He could feel the weight of her suspicion, the invisible wall between them. Yet beneath it lingered something more fragile, a thread of trust forming, however unwilling. Matthew leaned back against the chair, exhausted, the fire casting flickering shadows across the cabin's wooden walls. It wasn't until midnight that she spoke, her voice barely stronger than the rain outside. Run." The words were broken, accented, but sharp enough to pierce the silence. Matthew leaned forward, urging her gently with his eyes. She swallowed hard, her hands clenching the quilt. "They force marriage, old man. I say no." Her voice cracked and she lowered her gaze. "They beat. Leave me." The weight of her confession settled heavily between them. Matthew clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. In her words, he heard not only suffering, but the courage of a woman who had chosen freedom. Matthew did not answer right away. He sat there, staring into the flames, listening to the storm batter the walls. Finally, he said, "No one deserves that." His voice was quiet but steady. She glanced at him, her dark eyes glistening in the firelight. For the first time, he saw something shift. Her gaze softened, losing a fraction of its guarded edge. She lay back, exhaustion pulling at her eyelids, but she did not fight him anymore. Within minutes, her breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep, fragile but peaceful. Matthew stayed awake, unable to rest, the storm outside echoing his thoughts. As the fire crackled, Matthew studied her face in the dim glow. The bruises told a story of cruelty, but beneath them he saw strength, unyielding, unbroken. This was no helpless victim. She had chosen to run, to risk death rather than submit. He felt a strange respect rising in him, mingled with protectiveness. He was no stranger to loneliness, but never had he shared his home with another soul like this. He wondered what tomorrow would bring, if her people would come searching, if the neighbors would notice, if this act of compassion might cost him everything he had built. The storm raged until dawn, wind rattling the shutters, rain lashing the roof. Inside, the cabin held a fragile peace. Matthew rose once to stoke the fire, glancing back at the bed where she lay, curled beneath his quilt. She looked smaller now, vulnerable in rest, her hands clasped together as though even in dreams she was bracing against the world. He returned to his chair, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, watching the flames rise and fall. He felt the unease of stepping into a story bigger than himself, yet he couldn't turn back. The choice had already been made. Memories of his own past slipped into his thoughts. He remembered his father's hard hand, his mother's quiet endurance, the lessons beaten into him about strength and silence. Perhaps that was why her story struck so deep. He knew the weight of being powerless, of standing before someone stronger and having no voice. Though he had escaped that fate, she was still bound by hers. Matthew clenched his fists, jaw tight, as if silently promising that under his roof she would never face that again. The fire dimmed, but the vow burned bright inside him, unspoken yet unbreakable. When the first light of morning broke through the cracks in the shutters, Matthew's eyes were still open. His body ached from the chair, but he had not slept. He glanced again at the bed. She stirred slightly, her chest rising in steady rhythm. Relief washed over him. She had made it through the night. He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders loosening at last. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the plains washed clean, the sky pale with new day. Inside, Matthew Carter knew his life had shifted, though he could not yet see how far the ripples would carry. The morning stretched in silence, though it was not the silence of strangers anymore. Matthew felt the weight of Nayeli's words still echoing inside him. She had spoken them without trembling, her eyes steady, her will clear. He had never imagined such a choice being placed before him. Outside, the plains whispered in the wind. The cattle lowed faintly, and the world carried on as though it hadn't shifted. Yet inside his cabin everything was changed. A bond had formed, not out of chance alone, but out of courage. He wondered if he was worthy of it. He studied her closely as she sat by the fire, the morning light softening the bruises on her skin. Even in her battered state, she carried herself with dignity. There was beauty in her presence, not just in form, but in spirit, the kind that could not be broken by cruelty. Nayeli had fled something that would have crushed another, and in her flight she had found him. Matthew's chest tightened at the thought. She deserved peace, safety, a chance to live freely. Could he give that to her? A man tied to the land, hardened by solitude? Nayeli broke the silence first, her English halting yet strong enough to pierce the air. "I no go back," she said. "If I go, he find me, beat me, take me." Her dark eyes lifted, unwavering. "I choose this." Matthew swallowed hard. He knew what her words meant, even if she did not dress them in fine language. She was choosing him, his home, his world. It was a choice made out of defiance, but also out of trust. And trust was sacred. He had no right to take it lightly. His hands tightened on the table before him. "Nayeli," he said softly, the name rolling off his tongue like something precious. "This is a hard place, the frontier. Food runs thin, winters bite deep, dangers ride in from the horizon. If you stay not as prisoner, not as servant, but equal. Do you understand?" She tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly at his words. But after a moment she nodded. Equal. She had not heard that word from a man before, and she clung to it as though it were a gift. The day stretched on. Matthew worked the ranch, mending a broken gate, while Nayeli moved quietly around the cabin. She swept the floor, laid out the bread he had left, and tended to the fire. Her movements were graceful but efficient, as though she had always belonged there. When Matthew returned, sweat streaking his brow, he found her humming softly, a melody foreign yet soothing. He paused in the doorway, struck by the gentleness of the moment. His cabin had always been a place of silence, of emptiness. Now with her inside, it felt alive. That evening, they sat across from each other at the wooden table. The fire cracked, throwing light and shadow across the room. Nayeli tried more words, piecing them together with effort. Your land. Big. Work. Strong. You alone. Long time? Her voice held curiosity, not pity. Matthew nodded. Too long, he admitted. He saw her lips curve faintly, the ghost of a smile. Encouraged, he asked, You, before this? She hesitated, then spoke of her village, of laughter around fires, of brothers she had not seen in years. Though her words were broken, her meaning was clear. Days passed into weeks. Matthew taught her words in English, bread, sky, fire, heart, while she returned the gift, teaching him her own tongue. They laughed at each other's mistakes, the sound echoing in the small cabin like music. At night, they sat close by the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes speaking of memories. With each passing day, the distance between them closed. Trust grew roots, and with trust came something deeper, something Matthew had not dared to hope for. She was no longer a guest, no longer a wounded stranger. She was a part of his life. But the frontier had a way of testing even the strongest bonds. One morning, while Matthew was tending cattle, he spotted riders on the horizon, 3 figures moving fast. His heart clenched. He knew by their dress they were not settlers. Apache men searching. He hurried back to the cabin, his rifle across his shoulder. Nayeli saw the fear in his eyes before he spoke. She froze, then whispered words in her tongue, words filled with warning. They come, she said, voice trembling now. Matthew knew then that her past had not been left behind. It had found her. He stood at the doorway, rifle ready, as the riders drew near. Nayeli clutched his arm, eyes wide. No fight, she begged. Blood bring more blood. He swallowed hard, torn between the instinct to protect and the wisdom of her words. The riders stopped short of the cabin, their eyes sharp, searching. They called out in a language Matthew could not understand. Nayeli stepped forward, her back straight, her voice steady as she answered them. The exchange was sharp, tense. Finally, the riders turned, spitting into the dirt before galloping away. The silence that followed was thunderous. Matthew lowered his rifle slowly, his hands trembling. What did you tell them? He asked. Nayeli turned to him, her face pale but her eyes fierce. I tell them I'm free. I'm not his. I choose. The word struck him with force, stronger than any bullet. She had stood before her own people and declared her freedom, even at the risk of her life. Matthew felt a swell of pride and awe. She had chosen him, not out of desperation, but out of defiance and love. In that moment, he knew there was no turning back. That night, they sat by the fire as they had so many nights before. But something was different. The weight of her decision hung in the air, heavy but unshakable. Matthew reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. She did not pull away. Instead, she looked at him with eyes that no longer carried fear, only trust. The flames flickered between them, casting their shadows onto the wooden walls. 2 people from 2 worlds, divided by history yet bound by choice. The frontier outside was harsh, unforgiving. But inside that cabin, something rare had taken root, love. And so the days turned, not with the loneliness Matthew had once known, but with companionship. Together, they worked the land, shared laughter, and built a life out of trust and courage. Though the world beyond might never understand, they understood each other. In her presence, Matthew found the home he had been missing all along, not the cabin, not the land, but her. And Nayeli, once broken and beaten, found in him not just a protector but a partner, an equal. Their bond was not born of pity or survival, it was born of choice. And choice, once made, could never be undone.